We wish to welcome you to the third presentation in the noon lecture series of the
Recording in
Lieberthal-Rogel
progress.
Center for Chinese Studies for Fall 2023. The complete series schedule is available here today and on the China Center's website. Email reminders are sent out weekly. We begin with a few announcements. The Festival of Asian Music, a celebration of musical traditions from across Asia, will present the following performances and demos this week. On Tuesday, today, at 7:30 p.m., there will be a lecture and demo of wind instruments in the Watkins Lecture Hall of School of Music, Theater, and Dance. It's at 1100 Bates Drive. Tomorrow at noon 12, there will be a lecture and demo of string instruments in the Moore Organ Studio, room 2110, School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and it is also at 1100 Bates Drive. I guess you can also check out these events through the website of School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And also tomorrow at 7:30 p.m., there will be the gala performance of the soloists of the National Chinese Orchestra of Taiwan at Hill Auditorium, which is at 825 North University. All these three events, they are free and open to public. The next presentation in the fall 2023 LRCCS noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, October 10th. In the same location, it will be given by Daniel Koss, research scholar and associate senior lecturer at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Daniel Koss will be speaking on, quote, disciplining business, reinventing CCP networks as tools of economic governance under C, end quote. Now I can introduce our speaker. Today's presentation will be given by Mark Csikszentmihàlyi, who is the Eliaser Chair of International Studies, Interim Chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Director of the Group in the Study of Religion at University of California at Berkeley. He has a PhD in Asian languages from Stanford University and a BA in East Asian languages and civilizations from Harvard University. He uses both excavated and transmitted text to reconstruct the religions, philosophies, and cultures of early China. His most recent book is Technical Arts in the Han Histories, Tables and Treatises in the Shiji and Hanshu. Next year, Reaktion Books will publish his Confucius, a New Tradition. He is also the editor of the journal Early China. Today, he will be speaking on Tao, a 2nd century BCE conceptual biography. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. My last Michigan Brown Bag lecture was on February 15th, 2000. When I talked about the story of the drowning sister-in-law in Mengzi. So when Sonia Özbey asked me to come back and do another one, and I want to thank Sonia and also to Ina Schlor for arranging everything so masterfully. When Sonia asked me back, I figured that could only mean one thing, that everyone who was here for the talk in 2000 had finally retired, and lacking that institutional memory, they made the same mistake twice. Of course, in 2000, I didn't have tenure and was very concerned with saying things new and proving myself. 20-some years later, I have 2 children applying this year to the University of Michigan, one to the college, one to the medical school. They've relieved me of my burden of trying to impress people in Michigan. They're doing it for me. So I'm going to start this talk with a completely uncontroversial statement. Okay. Taoism is a terrible, terrible thing. And by Taoism, I mean the English word Taoism, a particularly ambiguous and generally heinous amalgam of an important but polysemous Chinese word Tao and the suffix ism, used for religions, philosophies, ideologies, artistic movements, and cults of personality. Faced with the truism that Tao should be translated as way or course, a student first introduced to this idea of wayism might imagine it as an ideology that perhaps supports, I don't know, continuous lines over discrete line segments? I'm not sure. But it's even worse than that. It's not just a problem of the neologism that was created. As Nathan Sivan and numerous others have pointed out at great length, in English, ism is used to translate both the Chinese words jia and jiao, terms that Chinese historians have used to distinguish two phenomena that are rather different, both temporally and in kind, but which share a tenuous connection and place the word Tao in a privileged position. So while Duke Ellington and Lorenzo de' Medici share historical importance, if another language used the same word for both the Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance, its speakers might think they share more than they actually do. And I know you know this, and I know this, yet as a teacher, over these 23 years since I was here the last time, I'm a little tired of being faced with this Sisyphean task of disentangling two things that are neither completely separate nor always completely well-defined. It's that rather hard to untangle them. And our notional foreign language speakers, what could be taught to distinguish between the Florentine Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance, for example. But even then, they might have moved a step further, but now the difference seems to be one of location, right? Of Florentine versus Harlem, when actually the Renaissances are different. They're different senses of the word Renaissance. So I found a slide I made around the last time I gave the Brown Bag lecture to try to teach things in this way. And this was from an early version of my Taoism course, and I'm going to use this because this is, okay, there, right? Haha. So this is not what I'm proposing today. I just want to say this is kind of an early version of trying to explain this difference, emphasizing that the Jia term, we have texts, but don't know much about the institutions that surrounded those texts, and the Jiao term have a plethora of texts, but are generally defined by institutional aspects. Okay, so that was my pitch 20 years ago to students trying to explain the issue with the English word Taoism. And today I look at this slide and I see a huge pedagogical problem with interventions that focus on the difference between Jia and Jiao. And I'm not saying it's an incorrect characterization of the way that this is differentiated in other parts of the world. But once you start differentiating between Jia and Jiao, or text and institution, or philosophy and religion, or Florence and Harlem, you're introducing a binary which somewhat perversely contributes to the sense that the one term that's shared between these, whether it's Tao or Renaissance, is the thing that doesn't change, right? So we're saying, okay, we're moving from one to the other, but the student, and this is apparent by the end of the class, that I still haven't dislodged the idea that these are somehow a continuation or similar. When I read the final papers, I'm like, but I told you that this is not a continuity in the standard sense. And I think that's the problem. I think the problem is that by focusing on the different suffixes, you're kind of contributing to the idea that the main term is static. So the rest of this talk is to sketch a different approach. It's a conceptual history of the word Tao with a focus on the role it played in political and philosophical arguments and the way it was used across different discourses and genres in the 100s BCE. By looking at the way Tao was used in the century leading into its first deployment as an ism in the Shiji, I hope to address the same problem in a way that preserves the historically contingent aspect of the word Tao in different contexts of beliefs and practice. Why was the word Tao used as one of Samatan's so-called 6 schools? And then you can continue to ask, why was it used as a heading in Liu Xin's bibliographical 7 summaries? And this is my first public presentation on this project, one that will continue by asking why practitioners like the Tianshi celestial masters used Tao to distinguish themselves from heterodox pretenders, and why others used it to distinguish those practitioners as a whole from others of the so-called 3 teachings. So it's kind of like an ethno-methodological foray into taxonomy in the history of Chinese philosophy and religion. En passant, at each stage, I would like to ask, what did Tao mean at these different times? And spoiler alert, in many of these contexts, I'm going to argue it's not singular. So the 2nd century BCE is fortunately a time when we have a fair amount of information that is somewhat datable. At the start of the long 2nd century, with the encyclopedic Qin work Lu Shu Chunqiu, that has a date of 239 BCE. In the early part of the century, the Ma Wangdui finds give us a snapshot of text circulating in Changsha just prior to 168. The Huainanzi is a synthesis from the court of Huainan around 139 BCE. And the Shiji records the compositions of various figures throughout the century from its fin de siècle vantage. Among the works, among these 4 moments of these works, some of these works are dedicated to Tao in particular, but most of them are comprehensive works. And I want to stress that we wouldn't expect them to have a single or consistent use of the term. So when I look at Lu Shu Chunqiu, I'm not arguing this is the Lu Shu Chunqiu position, or that there is a Lu Shu Chunqiu position, because it's largely an encyclopedic work, although opinions vary on that. Likewise, not all the sources portray themselves as comprehensive, and all of the sources are from different regions of early imperial China, and so might represent a local innovation or a cul-de-sac. So I'm not making a claim that what I'm constructing is a developmental model. Just because at a certain year this is what's represented, I'm not saying this shows that the concept has progressed to that point. So this is a slightly different project. Rather, what I'm trying to do is describe the changing semantic fields of a word to better understand how and why that word was used by Samatan and some of the others I mentioned, and what it meant to them, and in doing so sketch out a more cinematic picture of the historical period that leads to such consternation for me as a teacher. So I'm going to start with the Lu Shu Chunqiu, and I'm going to learn to change this with the right piece of technology. There. And there are about 300 instances of Tao in the Lu Shu Chunqiu, and I'm not going to be exhaustive here, but I'm going to be representative. One of the largest categories, there are basically 2 kind of ways it's used. One is as something jirdao. Often the something is the goal you're trying to reach, or the area in which you're trying to kind of, that you have a certain excellence in, okay? So one really nice illustration of this is a kind of quandary that someone is in. So this minister is escorting his ruler across a bridge, goes down to make sure there's no one under the bridge, sees a fast friend under the bridge, and we get this quandary. He's underneath, and he says, were I to discuss it, I would be forsaking the Tao of mutual friendship. You intend to prey on my Lord. Were I to say nothing, I would be forsaking the Tao of the minister. So he can't tell his Lord, or he would be betraying the Tao of friendship. But if he fails to tell his Lord, he's betraying the Tao of the minister. In the circumstance in which I find myself, only death is possible. So we could see this example kind of bridges between this category and the next category. So this category is the Tao of, for example, being a minister. But the next category is about roles, and he's also finding a contrast between roles. And so in the same period, you get contrasts between virtues, right? This is something I write about in my material virtue book, where you get these quandary cases where you have different virtues pulling you in different directions. Similarly, he doesn't know what to do because as a minister, he's got these kind of conflicting, as a minister and a friend, he's got these conflicting Taos pulling him in different directions. So in the circumstance in which I find myself, only death is possible. I think of this in a kind of a Hong Kong action movie like Wu Jiandao as the moment where, you know, you have to. So related to this is another way of describing kind of Tao in noun phrases, and that's particular roles. And the most common roles are those of rulers and ministers. And so in the different chapters, these are chapter titles from Lu Shicunqiu, you get Jun Dao quite often, Zhu Dao, Chen Dao. Sometimes you also have particular Daos of people, and you also have Tian Dao and Di Dao, although that's much less common than later in the 2nd century. So these are the kind of noun phrases. And I just want to emphasize something about this. So this is where my contention is that we don't know. If you see this Tao, you could think of it as singular, as the great Tao. But really, we have instances where it's clear that this is a plural word. So for example, in the Analects, there are 2 passages that talk about the 3 virtues of the benevolent, the wise, and the brave. One just lists them, and the other one says the ways of the gentleman are 3, humbly that I lack the capacity to reach. A benevolent person is not anxious, a wise person is not confused, and a brave person is not fearful. Zigong said, "You are speaking of yourself," right? A different use of the word Tao there. So here we have kind of the Tao as plural. Brian and I were talking last night about Herbert Fingeret's A Way Without a Crossroads, where he argues that there's an absence of moral choice in Analect's discourse. This could be seen as read that way, that because the gentleman's way is consistent, there's a kind of unity of the virtues, so there's no kind of alternative, you're either gentleman or not. Or you could say this kind of questions it. Clearly, in this case, there are more than one Tao. So for example, in this rhetorical question from the Lu Shicunqiu, death and defeat are things despised by men. How could there have been only one Tao to create security for Qi? Implying that there are multiple ways. And this is kind of interesting because in Lu Shicunqiu, there are also places where it says there's only one of such and such a Tao. So the singular plural question is not decided. The Lu Shicunqiu, of course, as I said before, is a very encyclopedic text that represents a number of different points of view. Chen Qiu, in his edition, puts every chapter into one of these categories, one of these different ways of different early schools, he calls them. So this is the other type of noun phrase that you get. But then there are also kind of verbs of possessing, achieving, or lacking Tao. And so you get de Dao zhi, you Dao zhi, or wu Dao zhi. And then there are certain rulers and ministers who are wu Dao, right? And then what that is, that of course becomes a category in Chinese law. There are some other verbs. I mean, I think each of these is really interesting in its own way. But generally, if you look at kind of verbs with Dao, this is the category possessing, achieving, and lacking. And we'll see as the century goes on, that kind of develops, that kind of opens up quite a bit. So I've been focusing on the Lu Shichun to give you an idea of the kind of different types of, oh, and here's one of these Yodao, right? So this is actually a really nice example because this is a kind of Mentian type of dialogue between someone named Hui Ang and a ruler, and the ruler says, I don't want this kind of discourse on virtues. What am I going to learn about? What will it benefit me to learn about benevolence and righteousness? And so Hui Ang walks him through this set of kind of 4 different kind of hypotheticals. And so to convince him that actually he shouldn't be interested in military might, but rather in Ren and Yi, or in this case, the way of Kongzi and Mozi, who both talk a lot about Ren and Yi, of course. So one of these phrases is, suppose, replied Hui Ang, I knew the Tao that would cause men, however brave, to fail to penetrate the flesh when they stab, and however strong, to fail to hit when they strike. This is like the game, if you could have one superpower, what would it be, right? So he's saying, suppose I had this, wouldn't that be great? And then it's actually a kind of chain argument. He goes through these things, kind of each one being better than the next. And finally, he talks about, suppose these people, there's this military thing, but suppose I had something that would keep people from having the will to fight you. And that is that's the argument that convinces the king that, well, maybe I should study Ren and Yi because it has this potential for kind of possibility of kind of psychological warfare of some kind. And then at the end, the king of Song said to his couriers, what is discrimination? The way my guest tamed me with his persuasion. Right? So this is a kind of, I mean, it's and the way this is phrased. So Chunyo Dao Yu Tzu. So the idea is, and I like this because this actually, there are echoes of this of way of phrasing things in the Analects that, in a way, in a situation, there is a Tao for it, right? And again, you can see Taoism as kind of connected to some kind of transcendent truth or a primordial creator spirit. You could also see it as a kind of mastery of a plural set of methods. And I think that in the 2nd century, we get both of those. And my argument is that at the end, somehow these two are used together. And you begin to see more and more writing that will use the kind of uncountable abstract Tao alongside these other Taos, and the two are kind of used together more and more. So looking at the Lu Shichun, a couple of the things you can observe about these uses is that generally they're either noun phrases of the form Trudao that describe either a particular aim or excellence, or are associated with a particular practitioner or role. But then there are also discussions of people who possess or lack the way, usually rulers and ministers. So when they're talking about roles, rulers and ministers are the key role in both of these uses, because the people who Wu Dao are also, and Yo Dao are often in the context of governance. And several particular aims and excellences are probably subsumed under them, as in true Tao methods of the ruler, or a ruler who lacks methods, right? So many of the individual particular methods we saw, things like the method for making sure your country has longevity, or Ren Yi Zhi Dao. Those are things that probably are part of a plural Zhu Dao, right? Zheng Shunwei, who taught at Huazhong Shifan Dashui for many years and wrote a number of books on the changing meaning of Tao during the pre-imperial and early imperial period, identified this particular sense of Tao as the key aspect of pre-Han discussions of Tao. And that's consistent with what we see in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, because we see that, but what we don't see is, and I just found this in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, someone arguing that the earliest version of Tao is the fundamental, all-embracing essence of all beings, right? But this term is not found at all in this Qin period text, or slightly pre-Qin dynasty, but Qin state text. Okay, so that's Lu Shi Chunqiu. So now we're going to jump a little bit ahead. I'm not going to do the whole typology because this is a lunch presentation. This is not a, I don't want to overwhelm you with data. But after looking at the Maung Dui instances, I want to note a couple things, that many more verbs are used. For example, in the relatively short text Jingfa, you get zhidao, right? So there's grasping the Tao about 5 times. And that's not a verb you see in the Lu Shi Chunqiu. It's mostly having or lacking the Tao. And so you get passages like this. Only those who are able to grasp the Tao are capable of clearly seeing the revolutions of the cycles above, dividing that of the ruler and that of the minister in the middle, and carefully examining into life and death of the myriad creatures below, and does not try to be the ruler of these processes, right? So this is a kind of, usually these texts are associated with so-called Huanglao, which is a retrospective construction by Sima Qian of what he sees as being kind of the late 2nd century essence of the teachings of Huangdi and Laozi, right? But it really, it kind of captures, I guess in this sense, a kind of a sense of the Tian Ren Di kind of natural processes which the ruler is supposed to stand back and let work by themselves, right? You also see a number of texts that talk about a cosmogonic Tao prior to other concepts. And again, this is something not, I think, certainly almost, you'd be very hard-pressed to argue anything in the Lu Shi Chunqiu really fits this description, I think. But so you have the Lao Tzu B text of the Dejing, 2 passages where Tao is creating things, and of course in the Jingfa, it's Tao that gives birth to the law, right? So this is a kind of a different discourse. Now, this discourse did exist in the Qin. We know that because the Lao Tzu, we find Lao Tzu passages that talk about this at Guodian, along with other texts that talk about kind of cosmogony, right? So this is a discourse that existed in the Qin, but it's not represented in, say, the Lu Shi Chunqiu, whereas it is represented in these texts. Finally, one of the key things that develops in the 2nd century is more and more individual works that are essays about the Tao. And in the Maung Dui corpus, you get the Tao Yuan, and also, of course, the Tao Jing as part of the Lao Tzu text that's in the Maung Dui corpus. Okay, so this is a type of essay that we'll see then becomes identified as almost a self-conscious genre in the 2nd century, and 168 is really one of the first times we get these. So then, if we go ahead a few decades, we get to the Huainanzi, and there are a lot of things you can say about Tao and the Huainanzi. I'm going to limit myself to a couple. One is this idea of the essay on the Tao, and we saw there were at least 2 of those in the Maung Dui corpus. The Huainanzi self-identifies that way. So with the new major translation, major et al. Translation, the Yao Lue chapter says, discussions about the way are surpassingly profound, therefore we have written many compositions on it, that is the way to reveal its true qualities. The myriad things are surpassingly numerous, therefore we have broadly offered explanations of them to communicate their significance. So here you also see something that I think is we're going to see in all the remaining texts, and that is Tao as a binary with another kind of conceptual idea. In this case, it's the one Wu. We're going to see it's also sometimes paired with Shi, and then finally it's paired with Shu. And so the Tao versus the myriad things, the Tao versus affairs, human affairs, and the Tao versus techniques. And this, again, you get Tao and De a couple times in Lu Shi Chunqiu, but really these binaries are new and really powerful. And part of the reason is that, I think, is that what you've got this kind of hybridization of two discourses about the Tao. You've got the ruler-minister discourses about the Tao, and you've got the kind of more ontological, epistemological kind of discussions of the Tao that are in the Laozi, that are in the kind of so-called Huanglao tradition. And as people are writing these essays about the Tao, just like the compilation of the Laozi, the part of this is integrating different views of what the Tao is. And so you get these different types of Tao being put into the same discussion. And so you've got the Tao, which is undescribable, and that's the first component, either chronologically or epistemologically, and that justifies or leads to or undergirds the variety of human affairs, the minister's way, or the other techniques that gain their efficacy from the fact that they are spokes on the wheel of the Tao. So in the Huainazi, there are over 600 instances of Tao, and at times it combines the earlier distinction between methods of the ruler and methods of the minister with the concept of a cosmogonically prior Tao. And so here's a really lovely example of that. This is from the Fanlun chapter. It says, therefore, the sage, what the sage follows is called the way, and what he does is called activities or affairs. The way is like metal and stone, musical instruments. Once tuned, it does not change. So somehow it's outside of the process of change. If one is allowed to use the word transcendent, there's something transcendent about this Tao. Activities, though, affairs are like the qin and the si. They need to be retuned continuously. Right? And you say, well, but this isn't a prior Tao. But you can't use this metaphor of jade chimestones and stringed instruments without implying the process of resonance, right, of musical resonance. And so really what's being implied here is that the Tao is somehow prior and unchanging, and that's the fixed note. And then the strings vibrate to it in some sense. And so the Tao, I think, I argue in this case, it's the kind of prior Tao that we're talking about, that we see in the Tao Sheng sections just a few decades before. Is this making sense so far? Following? Okay. Here are a couple of really interesting examples of the types of Tao Lun that are going on in the 140s or so. So 130s especially. 130 is a really interesting, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But so in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, we had this passage. The king of Sung said to his couriers, "What a discrimination, the way my guest tamed me with his persuasion." You remember that? That was Huiyang convincing his ruler about the utility of Kongzi and Mengzi's way over the way of military power. in the Huainanzi, we get this. The king of Song had nothing to say in response. When Huiyang departed, the king of Song commended his attendants. What eloquence, this guest has won me over with his, I should have taken that out. Won me over with his persuasion. Therefore, the Laozi says, one who is fearless in being timid will live. So it's the same story from the Lu Shicunqiu that probably people had access to, coupled with, used as a proof text for a line of the Laozi, right? So you've got your Dao Lun, and that's the Laozi, and you're using the stories to illustrate this, right? So you're making things converge to this kind of discourse about the Tao. This isn't the only thing people were writing in the 1/3 or in that century. It's a little bit like what the Han Shuaizhuan does with the Shijing, where you will use these anecdotes as kind of proof texts, or even texts like the Ziyi in the Li Ji do with a variety of texts. But this, so it's a common practice. But in the Huainanzi, in the Daoying chapter, what's used are, for the most part, texts like Laozi and Zhuangzi. Okay, so here's another one. And so I teach a seminar on the Zhuangzi, and I don't talk about this much, but one of the things that Ikeda Tomohisa and some other scholars who've worked on kind of Zhuangzi text formation have argued is that the Zhuangzi seems to have final sentences that, if you look at anecdotes in a number of books, and then in the Zhuangzi the anecdote appears, the final sentence is kind of a kicker that was perhaps the reason that collection was put together. And so we have this example from the Lu Shicunqiu again, where you have a story. Zhuangzi said, "What is worthless will live out the years heaven has given it. This is what Shennong and the Yellow Sovereign made their emperor, made their model." And you get the same story then appearing in the Zhuangzi, but with the last line. "Alas, my disciples, note it well, there is nothing for it but the old homeland of the course and its intrinsic powers." This is Ziporan speak for it's only the echo of Dao and Do or something. However you want to read this. But note that, again, you have a Lu Shicunqiu story, and then it's being glossed or being connected to an argument about Dao, right? So this is what I'm arguing, is that there's a kind of Dao Lun discourse. And who was a practitioner of the Dao Lun discourse? Well, now if we move to about maybe, let's say, sometime before 110 BCE when Sima Tan died, we've got this description of Sima Tan, Sima Qian's father, the senior director of astronomy, quote, "studied the celestial offices with Tang Du, received training in the changes from Yang He, and practiced essays on the Tao from Master Huang." Okay, so he's someone who's schooled in the essays on the Tao. And when he writes this incredibly influential taxonomy that really introduces this word Daojia, and then is taken up in some ways by Banggu, although, one wonders if Banggu, relying on Liu Xin and Liu Shang also, who studied Huang Lao in his early life, might be aware of this Dao Lun, and maybe his category reflects that awareness. But in any case, it's using this idea. So in chapter 130 of the Shiji, like the Tianxia chapter of the Zhuangzi, the idea is that there is this timeless Tao, which is kind of the epistemological or epistemic foundation of 5 other expertises of the present. In the Tianxia, it's a very similar structure, actually. But so in chapter 130, it says, experts in the Tao, after discussing these other 5 types of experts, cause people to concentrate their essential qi and spirit. Every move is in accordance with the formless, and it's sufficient to supply the myriad creatures. When they make techniques, I don't know, they follow the succession of yin and yang. kind of a Mercedes Valmisa yin here. Selecting the good from the ru and the mo. So this is one of the other jia. These are two of the other jia, and these are the other two of the other jia, right? Selecting the good from, assembling the essentials of Ming and Fa. So they're able to use all these different techniques, but somehow because they're the sum of these others, they are the optimal jia, right? So they shift in accord with timeliness and transform in response to external things. So if I were to kind of sum this up, I would say the formation of the category of Dao Jia is part of the culmination of the rise of the genre of this essay on the Tao in the second half of the 2nd century BCE. Sima Tan, trained in such essays, is familiar with its hybridization of a binary between the foundational Tao and its constituent techniques, which I'm arguing comes out of the kind of Lao Tzu Huang Lao kind of discourse, and a binary between the Taos of the ruler and that of the minister, the type of kind of minister-ruler Tao framework that we saw was very heavy in the Lushi Chunqiu, where those two Taos are cast as complementary sets of methods that are required to be a good minister or a good ruler. So in the Shiji, then, Dao Jia is the method for aligning oneself with that foundational Tao, coupled with the mastery of the plural Taos of the ruler. So it's a kind of hybrid category that's the result of several different ways of talking about Tao, or several perhaps independent ways originally that then have become kind of hybridized in this Daolun discourse. And so that's the argument about the first stage in this kind of conceptual history. Now, I'm not going to go through any of the other stages. I just want to share with you one of my favorite little passages that I found. So this is from a 19th century kind of survey of the ceremonies and customs of all the peoples of the world. And it's the account of where the celestial masters came from. And I just think this is, so this is the question now, what do we do when we talk about Dao Jiao? What's the background? And I've always thought that a lot of discussions of Dao Jia and Dao Jiao are informed by a kind of vision that I see in this quote. So this is an 18th century translation. It says, from the French, Lao Tzu's disciples practiced the black art insomuch that the quality in a very short time gave into it as the only science work worth acquiring. Everybody, in short, made it their study at last in hopes to avoid the gloomy apprehensions of death, and 1,000 extravagant and impious practices immediately ensued. The adepts of this sect, the followers of Lao Tzu, that is, perceiving how universally they were admired, added numbers daily to their profession. They had the honorable title of celestial doctors conferred on them. I can see it like with a little degree or something. Celestial doctor, like at the end of The Wizard of Oz when the scarecrow gets a degree. And several spacious edifices were erected for them that they might form themselves into regular societies. Even temples were erected in honor of their divine founder, and both the king and the people paid him divine adoration. And so this is kind of the fall of a pure philosophy into a ritualized religion, or maybe actually they're also involved in drugs, right, and immortality practices. So this is the kind of narrative, and I was really surprised to see in the 18th century you already have a narrative which I think informs like even into mid-20th century discussions of Dao Jia versus Dao Jiao. So I just want to say this is, so I set up the kind of problem, where did Sima Tan come from? I think the problem of you know, why Dao becomes so important and becomes selected as the way of describing the Tian Shi Dao and then later Shangqing and Lingbao traditions, as opposed to kind of Fo and Ru, is another question. And I'm hoping that in a next iteration of the project, I can kind of move towards kind of getting rid of this kind of implicit narrative that I think creeps into the discussion of this whole process. Anyway, thank you, and it's been 23 years, so I'll see you in 2046. And we do magically have time for questions, I think. Yeah, Brian.
We're going through the second slide a little fast. I was wondering, the one about Reaktion where you had 10 dao in the roles. At the bottom, I thought it said, At the bottom, I thought it said 天道.
Oh, yeah. So there are other uses. There's 300 uses, and there are some Tian Dao. There are 5 chapters have Tian Dao, and 2 chapters have Di Dao. And I'm bracketing that. Some of those, a number of those are in the kind of agricultural chapters, so they're obviously talking about the cycles of the seasons. My old way of looking at this was that this was originary. You know, you read about Fan Li in the Guoyu, or people, you know, were Tian Dao, and you think, oh, well, this is very long-standing. Mm-hmm. But really, you know, it's the Zhuangzi and a lot of these texts that kind of in the 2nd century really are where Tian Dao is very important. Here it appears first in the kind of the first section of chapters in the Lushi Chunqiu, which are calendrical kind of in their framework, and then in the last chapters, which are kind of agricultural, and only 1 or 2 times in between those. Okay. And I was very surprised at that.
Okay. As a follow-up, I noticed that you started out by saying you're shying away from seeing Taoism as Wayism. And there was one point towards the end where you referred to Tao in English, it seemed to be as technique. But mostly you shied away from translating it as method. But you
because Methodism is taken.
Sorry, yeah, so I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
No. Finish it. I was just making a joke about Methodism. Anyway,
go
on.
I was just wondering why you shy. So you translate as aim or excellence, which doesn't seem, it's not a standard translation typically of Tao, whereas method or technique seems more.
So I guess one of my problems is with ism, in the sense that I feel like that I usually think of isms as self-identified traditions, so that you can. I think it's fair to say that there is this Daolun kind of genre which arises, but in what sense is it an ism? I guess that's kind of my question. I think that I've shied away from. I use Wayism in the introduction, in part because I feel like there's just something kind of a misapprehension that students get when you frame it in that way. And so I didn't use that in my talk because I'm just a little wary of asserting that there is a kind of community that is producing this that we could describe as an ism, or that there's a separate philosophical school or something like that. I think that really the people we see involved in talking about the Tao are all across kind of Chinese society and the court in the second half of the 2nd century BCE. So I'm a little, honestly, I'm just a little shy about trying to replace Taoism with Methodism or something else, because so that's why the conceptual history approach. It's really trying to say that I'm not going to take a position on, there is there a set of people that believes deeply that in the 18th century language that worships the Tao, right? Rather, what I really want to do is just say, look, there's this enormous, there are these texts being produced in numerous different social locations by people in very different kind of parts of Chinese society, and they're all interested in the Tao and its application to various kind of areas in which they're employed. And so do I want to assume that it's a philosophical movement? I'm not sure. And so that's why I didn't try to replace Taoism with another ism. Does that kind of make sense?
No, I think my question was,
Okay.
didn't state it very clearly.
Okay, sorry.
So I was focusing on the way part of it rather than the ism part
Okay.
of it. And sorry. So a common translation of way
Yeah.
is method or technique or way. And you didn't use method at all. One time you used technique. And I'm just wondering why you shied away from those, because you draw a distinction between an aim and excellence on one hand and sort of cosmological processes on the other. If you translate Tao as method, meaning a kind of proper functioning, it turns out there aren't two ways of looking at it, right? You could have the proper functioning of the universe, and you can have the proper functioning of how to do farming.
Yeah.
And so translating Tao as method sort of unifies those,
Yeah.
as opposed to drawing this dichotomy that you have. Yeah,
no, I do think that well, I'm going too fast and too far, right? And I do think that in the Lu Shixunshu context, which I think is what you're hearkening back to, the Taos of the ruler and minister cast as complementary sets of methods. I do feel like that's exactly what we're talking about. So I completely agree with you. I think it's harder in the context of the Dao Sheng Yi, Yi Sheng Er kind of passage to say that that's a method in any sense, right? So again, so that's why I'm talking about the binary that's talking about kind of the originary or the kind of foundational Tao is a slightly different kind of set of connotations. And what happens is these part of what the Tao, almost all the Tao Luns are doing is mixing up these different kind of the kind of Laozi stream and the kind of the ruler facing south kind of scheme. Yeah. Other questions?
It's just a kind of a follow-up of what you just mentioned about the ism approach to the study of Tao, especially localizing in its native terms. In texts you have, such as Lu Shixunshu and Ma Wangdui, excavated texts, and Huananzi. I myself is also not a big fan of the Jia and Dao binary classification, so I really admire what you're doing here. I also noticed you have a quote sort of from the Analects, or is it from quote from Alex and from the Lu Shixunshu? So I'm kind of wondering, do you think this sort of reinterpretation of the ism approach to study of early Chinese thought can be applied to our understanding of other traditions such as Confucianism and legalism in early Chinese religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So not all the Jia are created equal in the sense that Ru and Mo, I think, we know from late Warring States texts, in pre-imperial texts, that those are kind of categories that kind of exist and are associated with a particular founder and a particular community produced in a certain community. So those two are a little bit different from the other four that Sima Qian is kind of, some of the others also have prehistories, but not like Ru and Mo. So I think that's a really good observation. I think when we're talking about the Analects, though, I think it is kind of interesting, what stage of Ru is that representing? Is that kind of the early stage, or is that kind of a collection that's put together, in the 2nd century, say? It's hard to tell. Zhu Weizheng, the kind of classical studies scholar at Nanda, published a famous article where he argues it was put together in the 2nd century. So then the fact that we have one passage that says, benevolence, courage, and wisdom all have their excellences, and then another saying, the Junzi's, there are 3 parts to the Junzi's Tao, and then repeats that same thing, might be showing that you have the same kind of accretion that we showed with the Lu Shicunzhou, and then the Huainanzi and the Zhuangzi putting little final sentences about Tao on them. But we have a kind of similar process, perhaps, with a prefatory passage about the Junzi Tao being put on a circulating kind of Yu Song type of Confucian slip and being put in an Analects at a relatively late date. Could be. I'm not really advocating that. I'm just saying that's within the universe of possibilities, that actually what we see when we see the Analects reflects a kind of similar process to what I was showing you is happening with Lu Shicunzhou stories as they're internalized into the Tao Lun in the 2nd century. Thanks for the question.
Okay, as Dr. Csikszentmihàlyi is going to be on Zoom, we have a virtual audience also, so if you could please use the mic when you ask a question, so everyone.
Thank you very much for your talk. I know that your primary focus today was not the Tao as this kind of fundamental, all-pervasive essence of all beings, but when discussing that sense of the term with students, I have found it quite useful to draw on Red Pine's etymology of the moon passing across the sky and this kind of invisible but real, waxing and waning. I wonder, do you find that etymology spurious, or do you think it's actually legitimate?
So I guess I'm more familiar with the whole not the moon, but the finger pointing at the moon kind of thing. Is this the same? No, this is...
I don't think it's that.
Okay.
He's drawing on Du Weiming, I think, and talking about there's this, although the human eye can't discern it, of course, it's not really there, but there's a kind of an arc that the moon follows across the sky, and even the character being Shou as a kind of a head, a proxy for a head, and showing the movement with the other radical. You know what I mean? It seems so plausible, and the students seem really to enjoy it, but it also seems like it could be a kind of a just so story or something.
No, it's hard with kind of etymologies or kind of explanations. It could be a just so story, but it is kind of useful. I can see where that would be useful. Robert Henricks has a similar kind of account of Tao, another just so story in his translation of the Malundui Laozi materials, where he talks about the field having the potential for growing every year, but even when it's not there, something like that. And so it's of that category, not warring states, but perhaps a useful heuristic, especially in a teaching context, I think. Certainly the Tao, we're told a number of times, especially in the Laozi, is not something that you can put into words, for example, right? So there is this quality of the Tao being, and there are 3 chapters in the Xinshu, in Jiayi's Xinshu, during our period here, that are all Tao chapters. They all have Tao in the title. And it's very clear there, some of the dichotomies are about an incorporeal Tao versus kind of techniques that are actually applied. And it makes it sound like, abstract physics versus kind of applied physics or something like that. So it's, again, a heuristic that has absolutely nothing to do with the period we're talking about. But so, I think there is something to that. And since Du Weiming was one of my teachers as an undergraduate, I'm going to be filial and accept that. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm actually a scholar of contemporary Confucianism. Yeah. But I have a question. I think is kind of inspired by my field work, but it's also located in the classical text, kind of dealing more with the more creative usage of Dao. Yeah, that is from Mencius. He said Confucius, 道二，人与不仁而已矣. Yeah, there are two Daos. One is benevolent, the other is not benevolent. Yeah. So why I say it's creative is, of course, Mencius self-aware, there's only one Dao. Yeah. So he kind of talks it like a satirically, there are actually two Dao, one is good, the other is not. Yeah. As we see, the more usual way, maybe just say, hey, they do not have Dao. Yes, I mean, yeah. But just kind of if we recognize there are many, this kind of more creative usage, the more reflexive usage, more meta usage of Dao, it may disturb like the more traditional, methods. I mean, usually regard the statement just as a statement, talking about one Dao a little bit. And I have another one related to the same citation, the same quotation of Mencius, yeah, in which we can also see that he not only talk about the Dao as a normative thing, but also as a highly moralized. Yeah, these two are kind of different. I mean, we can see like they are kind of a Tian Dao, the agriculture seasoning, is definitely normative. Yeah, but it's not moralized. So I'm a bit curious. I mean, just do you have some like a conclusion on how the moralized usage of Dao emerged in history? Thank you.
Yeah, so that, I mean, those are two great comments. I almost don't want to treat them as questions because they're both really interesting in and of themselves. I think to your first point, it is interesting that when, just more a comment on that when Dao comes into some of the kind of cardinal texts like Lunyu or Mengzi, sometimes the vocabulary is connected to these discourses about the way of the ruler and the way the ruler has to kind of contain or right their body in order to provide an example for the people. And so you get things like renji feng, right? So feng is the same type of word as shu, or shun, just, wu wei. The passage in the Analects about wu wei is about shun kind of just doing nothing in some sense. So I feel like these discourses bleed into each other, and we kind of retro-project Sima Qian's categories onto the pre-Han period at our peril, because obviously there's very close interconnection between things that we now call the Confucian tradition and the Taoist tradition or something like that, if we use those categories. So, and the descriptive normative question, I mean, yeah, it's descriptive when you're talking about Tiandao, and then it's normative once you have the idea that the true ruler doesn't he doesn't boss the heavenly seasons or the human distinction between ruler and minister, and doesn't change. I forgot what the earth one was, but that quotation we saw. Oh, see, I'm not going to be able to find it. Okay, but that one that talked about the kind of Tian Ren Dao levels, and that the ruler doesn't. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so this is from the Jingfa, right? So this is suddenly you use the description of kind of the natural course of things and say that the normative ruler should just let those follow each other. Other questions? I'm liking these questions. Yeah. Oh, it's coming.
I think it's a very interesting talk. Tao is indeed a very difficult, elusive subject. And I think in the first chapter of Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu himself says that if Tao can be explained, then it is not Tao, right? So it is, that means that the word Tao means so much, in its content. So you talk about the principle, the essence, the spirit, the way of performance. These are the kind of thing, the abstract things. But there are other ways of Tao, which is the performance, the behavior, and then the methods. That is another aspect of Tao you're talking about. So that's why Lao Tzu himself said, if you can explain Tao, that's not it. It cannot be put into words because the word, the Tao, means so much and so different in many different things. So being an emperor, you have the Tao. Being a minister, you have the Tao. Being a farmer, you have the Tao. Being a father, you have the father, a bro, or mother. You have being a son. How do you behave to your father? So these are the kind of relationship that are different. So these are all encompassed in the word of Tao. So that's why he said, if you can describe Tao, then it must not be it. Okay, just like a blind man tried to describe an elephant, right? But I think Lao Tzu is a very intelligent person, and he's in his position as the librarian of the emperor. So he had a opportunity to look at all different kinds of documents and literatures, although I don't know what kind of documents or literature at that time. But he certainly is a very observant person. He looked at how the sun and the moons and the stars and run. And this has been running for thousands of years. And they seem to be, nobody says anything. The sun did not say anything to the moon did not say anything to the star and to the earth, but it has been doing this for eons. So he wanted to teach people that if you want to live, you want to lead a good life, then you should a good life in harmony. Then we should learn from the universe, learn from the Tian, from Di. I think that's what he tried to say here. So all this, the 吕氏春秋 obviously, collect all these different schools of thoughts and put them together. But I think it just says all come back to one word, that 道可道, 非常道.
Right. Okay. Yeah. My only comment would be that I'm trying. It's very similar to kind of the talk and focusing on the multiple meanings of the word Tao. Part of what I'm trying out here is a methodology that doesn't assume that the Tao Te Ching is the beginning of Taoism. And so it's actually, so I think it's interesting that the first part of what you said tracks very closely with what I'm arguing, that there are a number of different definitions. Where my methodology is a little different is I don't want to assume that this all comes from a particular person named Lao Tzu, whose ideas then kind of undergird all of what we're talking about. So the one difference is that I'm trying to bracket the idea that we really know anything about which text came first necessarily, and just try to look at things in kind of a chronology and say, well, we have this legend about Lao Tzu, but how exactly did it get to the point where Sima Tan is choosing the word Tao to describe what he sees as the combination of all the useful methods that people use to govern. And so I appreciate the comment, and I just want to kind of underline one small difference between the way you gave an account of it and the way I tried to do it in this talk, and that's the figure of Lao Tzu, who I'm trying to erase because I don't know that he necessarily exists. But that's because I'm a skeptic and yeah.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I may have some kind of expert question about Tao, how to get there. So it seems to me the translation of Tao as a way indicates that it's a passage that people want to get there or can get there. I just wonder about whether there was any textual sources for understanding practice, how people can get there. And you showed the 目击到存 that for that one, I feel like it's so Confucius and disciple can just understand each other immediately with eye contact,
yeah.
and then that's a way of getting there. But it's not a way to get there because you just get it.
Yeah.
But for especially for I think for skills and artistic practice, people talk about this all the time. You need to practice in order to transcend methods. You go to non-method through method. Yeah, well, I guess like in Paul Jian's incident, that's how people, at least in later periods, talk about you get to Tao through practice, and then you gain this kind of harmony between your body action and then the idea.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if practice was part of the story in early text.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I like it a lot. I think this is one of my favorite chapters in the Lu Shi Chunqiu. When I took a seminar on Lu Shi Chunqiu with Jeff Riegel, that was the chapter I was assigned, and I remember reading these accounts of what I called metalinguistic communication, like communication above language between sages. And this is a really unique kind of a passage in the text because it seems to be talking about the transmission of the Tao from one sage to the next without language, right? And after that, when I started looking at metaphors of seeing and hearing in the Mengzi, I realized that there's actually this whole big discourse about how sages hear the Tao of sages in the past over time. So there's these passages, this is in my Material Virtue book, there are all these passages in the Mengzi about these 500-year sages. Like every 500 years there's a sage, and in between there are these worthies that carry on the work of the sage. But in the Mengzi and the Wuxing, like in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, there's this idea that there are ways of hearing that tuning into the Tao of the previous sages. The worthies in between see, the sages hear. And the idea is that that they use the metaphor of resonance when they talk about kind of the chung, the sincerity, it's sometimes translated. It's not a great translation, but it's kind of yenzipan with a chung. And so the sincerity of the sages is what allows them to resonate with the Tao of the past sages. And so this use of resonance when you're talking about Tao is also, so what practices are associated with that is another question. But there is this idea that there is what this passage opens up is that there's this even in the Qin there's already this theory that kind of the Tao is transmitted between sages across time in I think a really interesting way. As to other practices, yeah, I think that we do get things like Qingjing or Zhizu in the Laozi that seem to be referring to particular practices that have to do with reducing desires or I don't want to sound like Henri Maspero, but kind of meditative type practices that are associated with the kind of ways of the ruler that are being promoted, and that's very, very strong in the so-called Huanglao texts. So that's it. You know, I don't want to say that those are kind of early Taoist practices, but they're often part of the vocabulary that creeps into kind of second century discussions of the Tao of the ruler. Yeah.
Join me in thanking Dr.
Okay.
Csikszentmihàlyi for his excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.